Conference on Development Economics. We have 3 presentations. First is going to be Carlos Gustavo Machicado from INESAT, followed by Marco Gavincha from Universidad Autónoma Metropolitana, and then I'll be presenting the last paper. Just some ground rules. So we will give 25-minute presentations to the presenters, and then we will allow like 5 minutes for Q&A. Please type your questions in the Q&A box. And we're gonna do the presentation in English, but you can ask your questions in Spanish if you want. Solamente para recordarles, esta es la sesión Economía Monetaria. Vamos a hacer la sesión en inglés, pero pueden escribir sus preguntas en español en la parte de Q&A y nosotros las vamos a leer. Con eso, yo creo que estamos ya todos. So we have enough people. We have 54 people joining already the session. Let's give it 10 more seconds, and then I'll turn it over to Carlos Gustavo to start his presentation.
Okay, thank you very much. Let me know if you can see my screen.
Yes. And please mute your mic to the other presenters if you're not presenting. Thank you.
Okay, so we will start the presentation. No? This is a jointly work with Beatriz Muriel, Alejandro Herrera, Alejandra Goitia, and Martin Sikowitz. This is a working paper that it is already published in the PEP web page. PEP is an organization called Partnership for Economic Policy, and is the organization who sponsored this project. No? This is a project that intended to analyze the exchange rate policy in Bolivia with its implications for growth and employment. No? But it's mainly a policy paper, no, that analyzes the implications of flexibilizing the exchange rate policy in Bolivia, the implications on growth. Okay, let me start with the motivation. No? I will start with the historical motivation. It's not the first time that Bolivia had an exchange rate, a fixed exchange rate policy regime. If you look at this picture, you can see that we have had a fixed exchange rate regime between 1960 and 1978. And we have now a fixed exchange rate since November 2011. We have in the first period between 1960 and 1978, we had a fixed exchange rate, but we have a devaluation in the years 1972 and 1973 with a devaluation rate of 25% and 38%. No? What is well known in this when we have a fixed exchange rate is that when we remove the fixed exchange rate, when you flexibilize the exchange rate policy, you have inflation rate. You have inflation, no? And that's what you can see here in the period between 1960 and 1978. We have an average inflation rate of 10.7%. But this rate is because, you know, as I showed in the picture in the last picture. Between 1972 and 1973, we had a devaluation, and that's the explanation for this inflation rate of 63% in 1974. But if you took out this episode, you have an average inflation rate of 60%, which is very similar to the average inflation that we have since 2004, which is on average around 5.5%. So another issue that is always that you always see when you have a fixed exchange rate is that if you look at the real exchange rate, you will see that the countries experience a real appreciation, and that's what's precisely happened between 1960 and 1980. We have a real appreciation that you can see here, and now we have also since 2006 we have a real appreciation. Okay, so in summary, the motivation, the historical motivation is that The period between 1960 and 1978 is characterized by a high growth of GDP per capita, 3%, which is very similar to the rate of growth that we have experienced since 2004. No? We have an accumulation of foreign reserves, no? Very similar to what happened in the last years. No? We have a fixed exchange rate regime, no? That led to an appreciation of the real exchange rate. And from the fiscal side, you can see that always these fixed exchange regimes are characterized by an increasing fiscal deficit. No? But why is this a motivation? No? This is a motivation because we know how this period ended. No? And how this period ended is we have, since 1978, we have a fall in the net foreign reserves. No? In fact, in 1978, the Bolivian economy experienced a balance of payment prices that is very well described in this paper that I have with Tim Kehoe. And you know that during the mid-80s, we experienced an hyperinflation crisis, no? That characterized precisely with a huge devaluation and the dollarization. Here you can see the picture where I show the balance of payment prices. In fact, the balance of payment prices started in 1978 and ended, well, not ended, but the worst period was the worst year of this balance of payment prices was 1982, with a huge devaluation of 257%. So one of the main reasons and one of the main objectives that we wanted to do this paper was precisely to prevent, no, that a balance of payment prices could happen in the next years. No? And this risk is already, even though we have now a pandemic and a lot of things have changed since last year, no, the balance of payment prices, or the risk for a balance of payment prices, is still present, no, in the Bolivian economy. Okay, so well, something that I have to mention also that I have already mentioned is that there are a lot of similarities between the period of 1960 and 1978 with the period that started in 2004 and ended in the last year, because in this year with the pandemic we are starting a new period. But the similarities are that these two periods are characterized by a high growth of GDP per capita. In fact, are the two periods of the highest growth rates that Bolivian experienced in the last 16 and 70 years. No? We have an accumulation of international reserves. Of course, the accumulation that we have experienced in the last years is huge. We reached the 52% of GDP in 2012. We experienced also a fiscal surplus between 2006 and 2013, and a current account surplus also between 2004 and 2014. And we have a fixed exchange rate since 2011, no? And an appreciation of the real exchange rate. But now we have a current account deficit and a trade balance deficit. No? So we have an economy that has experienced twin deficits. No? And these current account deficits, although this year has been lowered a lot, has been lowered it's not as big as it was in the last year, but the fiscal deficit is increasing, no, a lot. No? In 2018, we have a fiscal deficit of 8.1%. Last year, it reduced to 7.2%. No? And in this year, well, we will have a larger fiscal deficit. No? But the most important thing that is happening is that the reserves, the international reserves, are falling. No? And why this is important? This is important, but because, as you know, to maintain the fixed exchange regime, the central bank intervenes in the monetary market, no, by selling dollars in order to control the fixed exchange rate. So if the central bank does not have enough reserves to maintain the exchange rate regime, no, it will be impossible to maintain the fixed exchange rate, no, and the devaluation will fall. No? And also we have an economic slowdown. We have, in fact, we have already an economic crisis, no, that is getting worse with this pandemic. So the literature on the balance of payment crisis warns that consecutive deficits, fiscal deficits, increasing debt, and falling reserves lead to an imminent devaluation of the currency. So the question that we wanted to answer with these papers was, so what are the potential consequences of raising or flexibilizing the fixed exchange rate in force since November 2011? So in this paper, we analyze the potential effects of modifying the fixed exchange rate on the macroeconomic and financial variables. In addition, we extend the analysis to the labor market level, and for this, we extend the computable general equilibrium CG model, the PEP11, including financial agents. That is, we include the central bank and the commercial banks. So there are some previous studies for this that we have to mention. First, the use of real financial CG models, because if you are familiarized with this type of literature of CG models, which are computable general equilibrium models. In Bolivia, these CG models begins with Luis Carlos Gemio, with a paper from 1993. He develops a neo-structuralist real financial CG model to analyze external shocks, macro adjustments, and stabilization policies between 1970 and 1989. This paper, this paper from Luis Carlos Gemio has been used a lot to analyze other issues. For example, we have the paper from Gemio 2001 and Gemio and Diebel from 2002, who used this real financial CG model to analyze external shocks. The most similar paper to ours is the paper from Speicher, Thiele, and Diebel from 2005, who also used Luis Carlos Gemio model to develop a real financial CG model to simulate the distributive effects of exchange rate policy in a highly dollarized economy like Bolivia. So they capture the main links between the devaluation and dollarization by incorporating financial portfolio balances. Previous studies, also CG model, the CG model of Gemio has been used to analyze poverty, climate change, foreign aid, labor issues, among others. And other CG models that have been used in Bolivia include the GTAP, the MAMS, the MASEPES, and other models. So our contribution to this literature, at least for the Bolivian economy, is that we are introducing a new model and data for Bolivia. This new model is the PEP11 model. This is the family models that this organization, call it Partnership for Economic Policy, have. But we don't use the dynamic model of the dynamic PEP model. In fact, we transform the PEP11 model by introducing the dynamics in the same way as Dervis, De Mello, and Robinson from 1982. And we also include an independent investment function between sectors. So I will explain I will not explain the model because there is a lot of equations, and it will take too much time. But I want to explain how we build the real financial sum, because that's an important thing to show that the model, in fact, represents what the Bolivian economy is. So to develop the real financial sum, we have two main sources of information for the real side of the economy. First, we have the input and output matrix for 2014. We wanted, it would have been better to use another, a more updated input output matrix, but we didn't have access for an updated input output matrix. And we also said, as we are using the input output matrix for 2014, we also used the 2014 integrated economic table both from the National Institute of Statistics. Then we follow the Reinhardt and Roland Holst 1997, proposed a top-down approach. That is how we constructed the social accounting matrix was first we construct the aggregate sum, which is called the macro sum. Then we disaggregated this macro sum with a relative broad sectoral breakdown. That is, we ended with a micro sum, no? And then with the micro sum, we balanced to make proper calibration of the real side of the CG model. So we ended with a sum, well, from the real side with 13 sectors, no? The primary sectors, which are agriculture and mining, manufacturing sectors, and service sectors, no? We had 6 agents, which are households, firms, government, rest of the world. And the new agents that we introduced are precisely the commercial banks and the central bank. We have 3 factors of production, which are labor, capital, and natural resources. We have 4 types of taxes: property tax, activity tax, duty, and income tax. And we have the savings investments where we separate, that is the novelty in this model, no? That we are separating between private investment and public investment. Okay, so in the macro sum, you can see what is typically in a macro sum. You can find the domestic supply, the intermediate demand, wages, utilities of benefits, transfer, taxes, interest. I don't want to spend much time explaining this. But for the financial side, you know that there is no protocol nor good practices to build the financial side. So the main rule that we have to follow is that you have to keep the balance between the stocks of assets and liabilities of the different agents. No? In fact, we used the stocks from the central bank and from the commercial banks, no, from 2013 and 2014, and from that we computed the flows, no, between these 2 years, no, and as we have only information for the commercial banks and for the central bank, from that information is that we try to compute what we have or to compute the assets and liabilities for the other agents, which are households, firms, and the rest of the world. Okay, this is a big picture of the real financial sum. If you make a sum of the financial side, you can see that, for example, for the households, you have deposits on banks, which is the relation between households and banks. You have cash holdings from the central bank. So it's very simple, this structure. No, we didn't want to complicate too much, because in fact it's not so easy to calibrate this type of models. No? Okay, then we have to, of course, as we have data for 2014, we have to simulate all the other data for the years between 2014 and 2019, and of course, to show that this model is well calibrated, we have to compare it with the observed data. And there you can see here you have the variables for the real side. You can see that the model makes a quite good work by replicating the observed data. No? Also for the financial variables, it's not as good as with the real variables, but we can replicate quite well what the data is showing us. No? Because you know that here the simulations starts in 2020. No? This is a paper that was made last year, so that's why we start in 2020. No? Something this part very fast. I just here want to mention, no, that from the production structure, you can see that the Bolivian economy is mainly concentrated on minerals. Minerals here includes also hydrocarbons, no? And is also concentrated in services, no? And the public administration has increased its participation, no, in the last years. No? From the trade structure, you can see that the main exports are mineral exports, that, as I have mentioned, no, it includes the hydrocarbons, so it includes also the gas exports. No? And from the imports, no, the main imports are imports related to the manufacturing sector. No? That means that the main imports for the Bolivian economy are capital goods and intermediate inputs for the firms. Why is this important? This is important, but because as you will see, the discussion regarding the real exchange, the real exchange rate, it has to do with if we want to promote exports for the Bolivian economy. And you can see that even though firms are not cannot export because or do not have a, 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 a competitive real exchange rate, no, they benefit from cheaper inputs by importing capital goods and intermediate inputs. No? Okay, I think I have 5 minutes more, so let me explain the simulations that we made. We simulate 5 scenarios related to the devaluation of the nominal exchange rate. The first scenario is of course the baseline scenario with a fixed exchange rate. Then we have a second scenario where we have a devaluation of the nominal exchange rate. A third scenario consists in a devaluation of the nominal exchange rate, but with a fiscal adjustment. No? Then we have a devaluation of the nominal exchange rate, but with a recovery of the terms of trade. And then we have a gradual devaluation scenario. No? In all these scenarios, we introduced a devaluation of 15% of the nominal exchange rate. No? We have also a fiscal adjustment that consists in a reduction of government spending of 15% also. No? We have an increase in the price of gas or an increase in the terms of trade also by 15%. And in the gradual devaluation scenario, we have a devaluation of 3% each year. That means that we have a 3% devaluation in 2020, then a 6%, another 3% devaluation in 2021, and so on until we reach 15% in 2024. Oh, okay. Okay, let me show you some results. No? Here you can see the impact of the 5 scenarios, no, on the growth rate of GDP. So you can see that in 2020, as expected, we have an increase in the rate of growth, but then we have in 2021, we have a decrease in the rate of growth. In fact, under 2 scenarios, which are the devaluation scenarios and the devaluation with an increase in the terms of trade, the Bolivia experienced in 2021 a negative rate of growth. But then there is an overshooting, no? And around 2024 and 2025, the economy reaches its steady state, which is around a rate of growth around 4%. No? So how we select or how we decide which is the best scenario, no, or which is the best or the most beneficial scenario for the Bolivian economy? So we computed the median and the median and the standard deviation, no, between these 5 years, no, for each of the variables, and you can see that the median growth under the devaluation scenario plus the fiscal adjustment, no, is 6%, no, which is the highest, which is not the highest, no, but is the second highest, no, after the devaluation scenario with the real exchange rate or with the terms of trade increase, which has an almost 8% of growth. No? So when I presented this paper, no, before we have the pandemic, of course, the recommendation was as this scenario with the terms of trade increase is a lucky scenario because it depends from the international conditions, no. So the best scenario will be the devaluation scenario with the fiscal adjustment, no, because we have here the second largest or the largest, no, rate of growth. Regarding the inflation, of course, when there is the devaluation, there is an increase in the inflation rate, no, in 2020, but then there is the inflation starts to decrease, no, and it reaches a very low levels of inflation rate around 2024 and 2025. Of course, if you don't want to experience this huge inflation, this huge increase in the inflation rate, no, the best scenario is the gradual devaluation scenario. No? So again, if you want to choose which is the best the best scenario, no, which is the scenario with the lowest inflation rate. The best scenario would be the devaluation plus the fiscal adjustment. But that is because we are considering the average between the 5 years. No? If you don't want to experience, no, which is precisely would be the recommendation now, if you do not want to experience a high inflation rate, once you devaluate, then the best scenario would be a gradual devaluation scenario. Regarding the real exchange rate, this is important to consider, because when you devaluate, what happens is that you have also an increase in the consumer price index, no? In the domestic prices. No? So even though most people think that by devaluating or by increasing the nominal exchange rate, you can also depreciate the real exchange rate. And here you can see that that's not always the case, because as prices, which are in the denominator of the real exchange rate, increases, even though you devaluate the nominal exchange rate, you also can experience an appreciation of the real exchange rate. And that's what we see with the red line, and also with this pink line or blue line, where you can see in the devaluation scenario that there is a real also appreciation. But again now, the best scenario where you cannot see, where you don't have this real appreciation, no, is the scenario that is where you are combining the devaluation with the fiscal adjustment. Okay, so here I have a lot of pictures regarding exports, no, how they are very similar. Always you find this overshooting effect, no. Regarding public investment, of course, the best scenario again is the devaluation scenario plus the fiscal adjustment scenario. Why? Because here, as you are reducing the government expenditures, no, the savings of the government increase, and that allows to increase public investment. No? So that's why we have you can see here with the green line that you have at least between 2021 and 2022, you can see that there is an increase in the public investment. No? Finally, well, I will pass these other pictures fast because I don't have much time. But finally, let me show the effects on the unemployment rate. No, here the best scenario is the devaluation, the gradual devaluation scenario. In all other scenarios, no, the unemployment rate increases between 2021 and 2022. But with the gradual devaluation scenario, you don't see that huge increase with the other scenarios. Okay. So, in conclusion, Bolivia went from a period of crisis from 1992 to 2003 to a boom period from 2004 until 2013, and is currently in a period of economic slowdown and in a period of economic crisis. No? And this last period has very similar characteristics to those that prevailed in the 1970s, prior to the balance of payment crisis of 1978. No? So we have twin deficits, increased external debt, low inflation backed by a fixed exchange rate regime, and declining international reserves. Thus, what are the potential future scenarios for the economy? We respond this by calibrating a Esg model, no, to a social accounting matrix for 2014. And the conclusions, no, in fact, have changed now, because these conclusions were when we didn't experience the pandemic. No? And without the pandemic, the best scenario was precisely the scenario that combined the devaluation, no, with a fiscal adjustment, But now, if you ask me if this is the preferred scenario or the best scenario, no, now that we have a pandemic and now that we cannot escape from the fiscal deficit, of course, to make a fiscal adjustment is impossible. No? That probably now I would recommend that the gradual devaluation scenario would be better. But after, hopefully in some months or at least in 1 year, we leave this situation of pandemic, of sanitary crisis. No, probably again will be the fiscal scenario will be the fiscal adjustment scenario with the devaluation. Okay, thank you very much.
Thank you, Carlos Gustavo. So we are on a tight schedule, but I'm going to read quickly one of the questions, and then I'll let you answer the rest on the Q&A. So let me just read the first part of the question. So which monetary rule did you use for the model? Is it a Taylor rule? And if you could also mention if there is, what's the main difference of the PEP model and a typical DSG model? So why don't you take that?
Okay, so we don't have a here in the model. We don't have a Taylor rule because Bolivian has does not use the interest rate as the instrument for the monetary policy. Bolivia still uses monetary aggregates as the main instrument for the monetary policy. So we don't have we didn't use a Taylor rule. No? And the second part of the question was what is the difference between a CG model and a DSG model is, well, the main difference is that in the DSG model you cannot differentiate between sectors. At least you can differentiate between 2 or 3 sectors, but here you can model for example, in the Bolivian input-output matrix, you have 35 sectors. No? You can here make the difference between, of course, you can differentiate between those all those sectors. No? The dynamics are also a little bit different here. What you have when you simulate the dynamics on a CG model, what you are doing is mostly replicating the same settings for 1 year for the following years. So of course the modifications that we made to the original PEP 1.1 model wanted to take into account these issues, but always the dynamics between CG models and DSG models are a little bit different.
Perfect. Thank you very much. I'll let you take the rest of the questions in the Q&A directly. Okay. You can type them, and then let's turn it over to Marco.
Thank you.
Okay, go ahead.
Thank you. I want to share full screen. Yes. You hear me well, I think.
Yes, all good.
Hi, my name is Marco Gavincha. I'm a student of a doctoral program in economics at the Autonomous Metropolitan University in Mexico. I'm glad to participate in this event. Thank you for this opportunity. The name of my exposition is The Determinants of Real Exchange Rate in Bolivia, 2006 to 2014. Well, this is the plan for the presentation. First, I will present an introduction with my motivation, my questions, and my purpose statement. Second, I will show you a literature review and the gap in this topic. Third, I will show you some key concepts. Fourth, I will present an analytical model. Fifth, we are going to see the econometric results. Finally, I will give my conclusions of this work. Well, I want to present you the evolution of the real exchange rate. This variable is reported by Central Bank of Bolivia. The vertical axis is the index of real exchange rate, and the horizontal axis is the time. If you see the evolution of the real exchange rate, there is a clear fall of this variable after 2006. The accumulated variation of the real exchange rate in this period was 46% in this period. And When the real exchange rate down, it is called an appreciation. In this research, I have focused on the period between 2006 and 2014. Why this period? It is because this period is interesting. I think it is a time of expansion of Bolivia's business cycles. In this period, the growth GDP was 5.1. Here we have, and and also we have an openness of the commerce in Bolivia. It was near to 7% of GDP. Other things is in this period, prices of the commodity prices are more high than other periods. And also we have surplus in fiscal balance. We have a surplus in current account, and we have the, the, the appreciation of real exchange rate in this period. Well, the natural question is, why is the real exchange rate appreciating? What factors determine the behavior of real exchange rate, and is the real exchange rate becoming a misalignment, overvalued? The purpose of the statement is, the purpose of this study is analyze the determinants of misalignment of real exchange rate in Bolivia. Well, what is misalignment? Misalignment is the difference between equilibrium real exchange rate and the real exchange rate observed. The first is, it is an estimated variable, and this is an observed variable. This is reported by central bank, and the result is a misalignment. Here I have an example of misalignment. In the vertical axis, we have real exchange rate, and the horizontal axis, we have the time, and we have two variables. The equilibrium exchange rate is here, and the real exchange rate reported by central bank. It is observed, and the difference between both is the misalignment. In this case, if the real exchange rate, the equilibrium real exchange rate is above real exchange rate, we have an overvaluation. In the inverse case, we have an undervaluation. Well, in the literature review about appreciation of real exchange rate, we have literature in Bolivia and other countries. In Bolivia, a strong idea is about the term of trade. Term of trades is a key variable to explain the appreciation of real exchange rate. And we have here the authors, the researchers who investigated this topic. And then we have another variable here, the capital flows. Here is Cerruti, Aguilar, and the other explanator is public spending or fiscal balance. And we have another authors. In the other countries, we have papers with a key variable as term of trade. But also we have a combination of terms of trades and productivity. We have some papers. They 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 say that the term of trade is a strong explanator of real exchange rate, but here we have uh, other authors that they suggest that productivity is a key variable, is an important variable to explain. Well, in Bolivia, we don't have papers that take account the, the productivity. But for example, there are some authors, some researchers that they tried to include uh, the productivity. For example, Montiel, Cerruti, Aguilar, but they didn't find evidence about the influence of real exchange rate, uh, the the influence of productivity in real exchange rate. But then also in the other countries, we have other other authors that they suggest that productivity is a good explanator of the the real exchange rate. And I think that um, there is a gap in the literature of the real exchange rate because there is no evidence, there is no papers about the relationship in between productivity and real exchange rate. Well, uh, I talked about the terms of trade. The theory says that an increase in terms of trade implies a fall in the real exchange rate. This cause effect is well known as a symptom of dash DC, the dash DC. The theory also says that an increase of relative productivity implies a decrease in real exchange rate too. This is a relation that is well known to everyone as a Harrow-Balassa-Samuelson effect here. What is the difference between these topics? Um, Here we have a difference. For example, in the first graphic, we have an expansion in tradable sector. Here, there is not a change in the production of the not tradable sector. Instead, in the next graphic, in Harrow-Balassa Samuelson, there is an expansion in both in tradables and not tradable sector, but the major increase is in the tradable sector. The not tradable sector has an expansion, but is less than the tradable sector. Well, to investigate the influence of the term of trade and relative productivity, I propose the following analytical model to estimate the equilibrium real exchange rate. The determinants are government spending here, openness, capital flows, productivity, and term of trade. Um, openness has a direct relationship with the real exchange rate, and the other variables have an inverse relationship. Government spending here is measured as a ratio of nominal public consumption and nominal GDP, both from the demand side of national accounts. Openness is the ratio of nominal imports to nominal GDP, both from the demand side of national accounts. Two, capital flows are the ratio between imports minus exports to, to GDP, everything in real terms. The proxy of relative productivity in the real GDP per capita is a real GDP per capita of Bolivia divided by real GDP per capita of commercial partners. Finally, term of trades are the ratio between an index of export prices and index of import prices. I worked with official data, quarterly data from 1990 to 2016 for econometrics motive. One important feature of these variables is that the term of trade have a partial relationship with the real exchange rate. Here we can see this partial relationship between these two variables. Instead, relative productivity has a strong relationship with the real exchange rate. Here, like in the second graphic, it's like a mirror. Well, the econometric approach is the vector error correction model. The following chart shows three models, but the best model is the third. I found that the parameter estimated of government spending is minus 0.5 here. The parameter estimated of capital flows is minus 0.48. The parameter of openness is 0.09. Finally, the parameter of relative productivity of Bolivia in respect of productivity of Chile is minus 0.47. The regression has dummies. In 1995, we have a dummy because of the tequila effect. In 2002 and 2003, we have a dummy because of the Argentinian crisis. In 2008 and 2009, we have a dummy because of the Great Recession. And finally, we have a dummy in the 2014 because of climate problems. The terms of trade didn't result as a relevant explanation in model 3. I put 3 models because I want to show you that my 3 proxies of Balassa-Samuelson effect are similar here, here, and here, and here. The 3 proxies reflect the 3 principal partners in commercial terms, the US, Peru, and Chile. I tested also the autocorrelation, heteroelasticity, homoelasticity, and exogenous test. The model, the 3 models passed, they passed the test. After you have the betas, you can calculate the equilibrium real exchange rate with the betas and with the permanent component of the determinants. Here you have my estimation of equilibrium real exchange rate in the solid line. To compare, we have the real exchange rate reported by central bank. And here, this graph says that there was an undervaluation between 2006 and 2012 with a magnitude of 2.1%. Then between 2013 and 2014, we have an overvaluation of a magnitude of 0.6%. This means that the appreciation between 2006 and 2014 was a phenomenon of equilibrium. The misalignment is not large in this period. Well, my conclusions are following. The Balassa-Samuelson effect is important to explain the real exchange rate in Bolivia. The Balassa-Samuelson effect suggests that the neutral double sector has shifted up in the production possibility frontier. Finally, exchange rate policy of Central Bank Bolivia was coherent in 2006 and 2014. Thank you very much.
Oh, okay, thank you, Marco. So let's see if does anyone have questions that you want to type in the Q&A? Or Carlos, Gustavo, do you have a question? So I'm a bit surprised that your result says that misalignment was relatively small. I mean, so what is the reference compared to other papers? What has changed compared to what other people have done?
Well, I have a chart I can show you. There is a work from Cerezo and Salazar, for example. They calculated the misalignment, and they didn't find large misalignment too. For example, 2002 to 2010, for example. This is a reference of the magnitude of misalignment. There are other papers too, and they are similar. The difference with my paper is the explanators, the variables.
Okay, hay una pregunta de Beatriz. Dice, tus resultados son robustos al periodo. Pienso que lo ideal sería tener una serie más larga. De hecho, la PPP se cumple en un periodo bastante más largo. Puedes responder en español si gustas.
Perdón, ¿me puedes repetir la pregunta?
Tus resultados son robustos al periodo. Esa es la pregunta. Y si es posible tener una serie más larga ya que la PPP se cumple en un periodo bastante más largo.
Sí, los resultados son robustos. Una de las limitaciones del trabajo es que está tomando en cuenta el periodo desde 1990 al 2013 con series trimestrales, al 2016, perdón, y pienso que esto es una limitante porque lo ideal sería trabajar con datos anuales y con series más largas, pero el trabajo sí cumple con los test requeridos. Luego, este tema de la observación de que la PPP se cumple a largo plazo, sí es muy cierta, y por esa razón se debería estimar este tipo el equilibrio en real exchange rate con data más larga y anual. Entonces, sí está en un proyecto futuro poder evaluar estas ideas con datos anuales y con una data más larga, ¿no?
Okay. Any other question from the audience? I think there's a question for Carlos Gustavo that is from the previous paper, but okay. So if anyone has questions again for this paper, they can ask in the Q&A, and then we can take them also at the end if we have extra time. So thank you, Marco. So we move to the final presentation.
Thank you, Pablo.
Okay, so can someone tell me if you see my screen? All right, do you see my screen? Yes. Okay, good. So I'll be presenting a joint work with my colleague Sanjay Singh from the University of California, Davis. Again, these are my personal views and do not represent the views of the Board of Governors or the Federal Reserve System. So the paper I'm going to talk to you about is about, it's titled Understanding Persistent Zero Lower Bound, ZLB. We do theory and assessment. And the reason why we think this is an important paper is because of this idea of the threat of Japanification, which I'm going to describe very briefly by reading two quotes from the chairman of the Federal Reserve and the past president of the European Central Bank. So Jerome Powell in October 2019 mentioned that, of course, we watch the situation in Japan and now the situation in Europe, and we know that there are significant disinflationary pressures around the world, and we do not think we are exempt from those. Later, early this year, before all the COVID-19 situation, Mario Draghi mentioned that I believe that for the euro area, there is some risk of Japanification, but it's by no means a foregone conclusion. So what exactly is this risk of Japanification? So when we look at the data, here's a figure that shows you the inflation rate and the nominal interest rate for Japan and the United States from 19, and then the blue dots in this figure are the combinations of interest rates and inflation observed in the US. The red squares are the equivalent numbers for Japan. And as you can see in the blue dots, the United States usually had roughly an inflation rate hovering around 2%, within nominal interest rates in the range of somewhere 2 to 6. And you can see that there's been a decline, although you don't see the time series here. You see that interest rates somehow have come down after the financial crisis in 2008.
We are not seeing the picture.
Oh, sorry. To you. Do you see the picture now?
Yes.
Okay. So let me recap there 1 second. Sorry about that. So the blue dots here are the combinations of the inflation rate and the nominal interest rates in the US, and the red squares are the same data for Japan. You can see that the blue dots, the inflation rate and interest rates were positive in the US for most of this period, except for the ones that you see at the bottom in the x-axis, which correspond to the period during and after the financial crisis in the United States. Whereas the red dots, you can see that Japan has very few squares with positive interest rates and positive inflation, whereas most of its observations have fallen to the left of this figure, in which the inflation rate is negative and interest rates are at 0. All right, so this is a feature in the data that's really puzzling, and in the sense has triggered a long literature in understanding why did Japan converge to this region, which people associate with the liquidity trap, in which interest rates are stuck at 0 and then we experience deflation. So this is the risk of Japanification, right? The blue dots moving towards where the red dots are,
Pablo,
and then that's the cause of concern.
See your
yes.
Slides. We see one slide, but we don't see that you're
Okay, so
changing the slides. I don't know why.
Let me try this again. Do you see my screen?
Yes, we see your screen.
Okay, so let me give it a try here.
Now we can see that you're changing. Yes.
Okay. So let me open this from here. Now?
Yes, now we can see.
Okay. All right. So I hope at this point, let me summarize this again. The threat of Japanification is the blue dots in the US going to where the rods are in Japan, and we're concerned about negative inflation and interest rates at 0, right? So what exactly is it that people think about this issue? And there are two views to understand why there is this episodes of persistent stagnation with low inflation and 0 interest rates. One view is that these episodes are driven by changes in expectations, what are usually referred to as expectation-driven liquidity traps. This theory has been studied in the context of the Keynesian literature using representative agent models. And there I list a couple of papers that work on this topic. But the general idea is that pessimism of agents about future inflation, combined with the fact that interest rates cannot, the nominal interest rate that the central bank sets cannot go below 0, causes this self-fulfilling equilibrium in which interest rates become 0 and inflation becomes negative. An alternative view to the data that I showed you is relation is one in which there's a persistent decline in the natural rate of interest caused by a large number of factors, including demographics, the change in the supply of safe assets, which combined with a nonlinearity, the same nonlinearity that implies that the interest rate cannot be below 0, can cause these episodes of stagnation. This kind of view of the world has been summarized in the work of Hansen, Summers, and most recently using overlapping generation models, as in Menrota, Robinson, and Caballero and Farhim. So as you can see, there are these two ideas that have always been treated in different frameworks. And what we do in this paper is kind of try to bring these two things together. Okay, so the paper is going to have three questions that I'll mention to you. The first one is if it's possible to think about both views of secular stagnation and expectation traps within a unified framework. And our answer is going to be yes. We're going to do that by allowing movements in the long run real rate to kill off strong Fisherian effects in which that link the nominal interest rate to inflation. We're also going to show you that how much nominal rigidity or price stickiness or downward weight rigidity are key to differentiate these two types of hypotheses. Now, why does this matter is our second question. And the reason why we think this is really important to distinguish whether we become, or an economy becomes like Japan, or becomes because of changing expectations or because of secular stagnation, has to do with the different policy implications. And I'll show you that in some very simple graphics. And finally, since these two things have different policy implications, we ask the question whether can we tell these two hypotheses apart in the data. And we use Bayesian prediction pools to do this, and our answer is yes, you could do that, but there's a high degree of uncertainty. So we also argue based on this that there's a need to think about robust policies that can help the economy perform better in the situation in which it has been during periods of low interest rates and low inflation, independent whether that's been driven by expectation traps or by secular stagnation. All right, to give you a quick preview of the results and then so that you remember sort of like the key parts of the presentation, we're going to have two sets of results. The first one is going to be analytical. I'm going to show you that in very simple supply and demand diagrams. And then the second part is going to be quantitative results. The first, the analytical results are going to introduce the idea of expectations traps and when do expectations trap occur. And that depends, is going to depend fundamentally on the degree of price stickiness. Then there's going to be a result about how can we generate these secular stagnation episodes through discount shocks that lower the natural rate in our framework. Also mentioned as we go to those examples that in this environment, price and wage flexibility can, I'm going to show you that that can yield worse outcomes in the sense that they can open up the possibility of entering expectation traps. Once again, the source of attention is going to matter, and then we will look at that in terms of the policy prescriptions as a motivation for our quantitative exercise, in which we'll look at the data for Japan and find that Japanese experience is consistent with expectation-driven trap, that the real-time assessment of such trap is uncertain, and we bring to the front the idea that non-linearities, equilibrium selection, and model specification are going to be key factors to kind of make the inference difficult. So our final takeaway is that we need to complement this real-time assessment of what is pushing interest rates, nominal interest rates and inflation in a given country with tools that allow you to think about robust policies. Okay, so let me skip the literature. There's a big literature both on liquidity traps that are expectations driven. As I mentioned, there is new work on secular stagnation, and we contribute to both of these plus to some other quantitative applications. All right, so the rest of my presentation is going to be split in 3 sections. So I'm going to give you the hint of what the structure of the model is, and especially introduce the modified Euler equation. So this modified Euler equation is going to be central. It's going to be just one small modification we do to the standard New Keynesian model in order for us to allow to have both theories present in our framework. Then I'm going to bring you to a graphical representation and finally move to the quantitative evaluation of the Japanese experience. Okay, so our model in a very quick nutshell is going to be a standard 3-equation New Keynesian model in which we modify the Euler equation to allow for discounting. We're going to do that by introducing bonds in the utility function. On the supply side, it's going to be very standard. There's going to be intermediate goods. And then monetary policy is going to follow a Taylor rule subject to the 0 lower bound constraint. That, again, means that the nominal interest rates cannot be set below 0. And then there's going to be some shocks into the model that are going to help us explain the dynamics and the data, and those are going to affect the government expenditure, productivity, and markups. So in this model, actually, the 3 equations are equations 1 to 3. So the first equation is going to be the Euler equation, and this is going to give us the aggregate demand part of the economy, and it links, as you might recall from the basic model. The one key modification that we have is the term delta CT tilde that shows up in this equation. And I'll go back to that in a second to show you how this modification changes the interpretation in this model. The second equation is the aggregate supply part of the economy. This is the optimality condition of the firms in the model, which relates inflation to output through the mechanism of price adjustment rigidities, which are going to be controlled by the parameter phi. I'm not going to get into details about that, but this is going to give us an aggregate supply relationship that relates output and inflation. Finally, the third equation is the monetary policy rule that tells you how the central bank sets the nominal interest rate that the households take into account when making the decisions. And there is this nonlinearity caused by the fact that the gross nominal interest rate has to be greater than 1. And whenever it's greater than 1, it's going to follow a simple reaction function summarizing the behavior of the monetary authority. Equation 4 in my 3-equation model is just the resource constraint. Okay, so what is the intuition here? When you take the Euler equation, there's this additional term that shows up as a form of a wedge that distorts the optimality, the optimality condition of households in terms of what they would like to do, how their consumption would respond to the real interest rate. If you think about this equation and then look at it in steady state, you can clearly see that this wedge shown here now in the second line creates a gap between the discount factor and R star, which is going to be the natural interest rate of this economy. So the natural interest rate is going to be the natural the natural rate that exists in the, think about this, in an economy with fully flexible prices or in full employment for that matter. So this natural interest rate now in this model is going to depend on 2 parameters. It's going to depend on the discount factor of the household, but also is going to depend on this parameter delta that controls, in our setting, the demand for liquidity or the demand for bonds of the households. So when you set delta equal to 0, you go back to the standard textbook Euler equation in which the natural interest rate in the model is fixed at the inverse of the discount factor of the household. That means we can calibrate that discount factor and then define the natural rate of the economy. So that the problem with that is that we would never observe in that world fluctuations in the natural rate of interest that are persistent, because eventually the economy has to go back to a steady state in which the natural rate is fixed. That means if interest rates, real interest rates, are calibrated to be, say, 4% or 2%, we can have temporary deviations, but then eventually the economy has to return to those natural interest rates. And that, just to relate to something that you might care more deeply, this natural rate is what controls or is directly related to the long-run growth rate of the economy in this very simple setting. Now, when we allow this wedge to be positive and we set delta greater to 0, now we can separate the discount factor and then calibrate that to a certain number, and then allow the natural interest rate to move up and down depending on the values of delta. So when delta is going to be high enough, that is going to push the natural interest rate into negative territory without violating any transversality condition in the model. This is the key part that allows us to generate secular stagnation episodes in a representative agent, which is kind of consistent with this view that there might be changes in the demand for liquidity, for example, in the economy that push real interest rates down, which make the possibility of secular stagnation something feasible in the model. And there are multiple interpretations that we can give to this wedge delta, but I'm not going to get into the details. There are some references there. These ideas of generating discounting in the Euler equation have been present in multiple parts of the literature, both for closed economies, but as well for open economies. Okay, so that's sort of like the theoretical setting where we're going to work. And now I'm going to walk you through the aggregate supply, aggregate demand representation, where you would see how this works. Okay, so going back to the aggregate demand equation, that's going to come directly from the Euler equation. When you plug in the policy rule, that's going to be given by the red line. So when the interest rate is not constrained by the 0 lower bound, there's going to be this negative relation between inflation and output. And the reason is very simple. It's a standard intertemporal substitution. When inflation goes up a bit, the central bank increases interest rates more than proportionally, right? Which ends up in equilibrium, increasing the real rate, which lowers consumption and output. So there's a negative relation between inflation and output. However, when you enter into the zero lower bound territory and interest rates cannot move, as it has been the case of Japan and also for the US and the Euro area, and again in the US in the recent periods, there's a positive relationship now between inflation and output. So if you want to think about it, now we have an aggregate demand equation that has a positive slope. These positive slopes happen precisely because now the nominal interest rate cannot respond. And because the nominal interest rate is fixed at zero, any increase in inflation is going to lower the real rate. Because the lower real rate is going to stimulate households' desire to consume, there's going to be a positive relationship between output and inflation. So that's the key part of the red line. Now, on the supply side, this is very simple. I mean, we can show in the paper that this relationship is linear, and we do an linearization of the model. But at the end of the day, what happens is you have an aggregate supply relationship that generates a positive relation between inflation and output. Think about this as your standard Phillips curve. Now, when the natural interest rate, R star, the object that I mentioned before, is positive, and if the aggregate supply curve is sufficiently flat, that means there are enough price rigidities, then the intersection between aggregate demand and aggregate supply is going to be at a point like F. At that point, there's going to be only one intersection that's going to be consistent with what we call the targeted inflation steady state, which is, let's say, the best allocation in this economy. And we'll call it YF and PIF, just to make a reference to full employment. Inflation is at the target of the central bank, and the nominal interest rate is positive. Now, let's suppose that, again, the real interest rate, the natural interest rate remains to be positive, but now let's kind of tilt the aggregate supply equation by making prices a little bit more flexible. And you can see from this figure, the gray line used to be where we were in the previous slide, and now the blue line is going to be the new aggregate supply equation. Now there's going to be a second intersection, point B, in which we're going to have inflation and output to be at lower values than before, and we're going to name this point the expectations-driven trap steady state. So this happens precisely because of this notion that interest rate cannot be set below zero, which generates this kink between inflation, this kink in the aggregate demand equation. And when the aggregate supply equation is steep enough, then you end up in a situation like point B. And this is what we tend to think about as an expectations-driven trap. Why is an expectations-driven trap? Is because there is no direct way to select between point B and F, because there's no fundamental change in the economy. The natural rate is still positive, but now there is a multiplicity of steady states. Okay. So here also you can see how greater nominal price flexibility opens up the possibility of finding this point B in our diagram. Finally, the third result is to think about what would happen if the natural interest rate were to become negative. Say, for example, because in our model, there's higher discounting or higher demand for liquid bonds, an increase in delta. If we keep sort of like our aggregate supply equation as before, right, if it's kind of relatively flat, then we can move from point F to point S. So what is happening here? So the increase in delta is shifting the aggregate demand equation up, consistent with the idea that now we want to consume less for the same level of inflation. And that moves the curve towards, from the gray line towards the red dashed line. And then you can see that there's an intersection there. Now there's no two intersections, but now we have moved from point F to point S. And at point S, again, we have a situation in which output is below full employment, inflation is below the central bank target, and the interest rate, again, is equal to 1, okay? So this is the key machinery to think about what is the difference between secular stagnation and expectations-driven traps. All right, why do we care about doing all this stuff? The reason why we care about doing this stuff is because there are different policy implications for a multitude of things that we think are potential policies we can implement in the presence of a liquidity trap. So consider the panel on the left when we're in an expectations-driven trap starting at point B. If we were to do some aggregate demand policy that shifts the aggregate demand curve, say an increase in government expenditure, for instance, or some other government policy, here we're not going to specify what it is. you can see that increasing a policy that increases aggregate demand is going to shift the aggregate demand schedule all the way to the right, and the new intersection is going to be at point B prime. It so happens, although a little bit counterintuitive, that we end up in a situation in which output and inflation are even lower than where we started at point B. The opposite happens when we are in a situation of secular stagnation. If we were in a world of secular stagnation, an aggregate demand policy that shifts the aggregate demand schedule out will actually be stimulating for output and inflation, moving us from point S to point S prime in panel B. Okay, so just with this example, you can already tell that expectations-driven traps have different implications than secular stagnation traps. And then it matters for a policymaker to understand where you are before you implement any type of policy. Okay, in the paper, we do a much more detailed analysis of different policies that people have suggested using our very, very simple setup. But at the end of the day, right, what we care about is sort of figuring out whether we are in the panel on the left, an expectations-driven trap, or a panel B, and secular stagnation. Okay, in the next few minutes, I'm going to talk about the last part of the paper, which is the quantitative evaluation and trying to bring this machinery to the data. What we're going to do is take Japanese data. We're going to, linearize the equations that I showed you before around two different steady states. One steady state is going to be what I call B, point B from the graphs, which is going to correspond to the expectations trap steady state. We label it B in reference to the original paper that came up with this idea, which is the paper by Benavides, Schmidt, Grohe, and Uribe, hence the B. And we're also going to approximate the model around point S, corresponding to the secular stagnation steady state. Once we approximate the model around these two steady states, we're going to solve for its local dynamics. We're going to estimate that model using Japanese data from 1995 to 2012. We're going to use data on output, consumption per capita, and the GDP deflator that's a measure of inflation. And this is a period in which interest rates are going to be at zero. So we're going to be able to estimate a model, or two models, in which monetary policy is permanently constrained by the zero lower bound. This is already a feature very interesting of secular stagnation models, that we can have essentially interest rate peg as part of our analysis. There's no problems in terms of solving and estimating models in which there's an interest rate peg using our framework. Taking that, we're going to exploit likelihood-based methods to do a comparison whether we are in secular stagnation or in an expectation-driven trap. Okay, so how do we do that? Are we in an expectations trap or in secular stagnation? So we're going to think about if a policymaker that's confronted with the two models, model B, the expectations trap, and model S, the secular stagnation trap. We're going to construct prediction pools along the lines of Dziwicki and Misano, Del Negro and co-authors. And the idea is that the policymaker can infer the marginal likelihood of each additional observation under each model. That's going to be the one period ahead predictive density. With the predictive density, we're going to construct a pool that has a weight, right? So the policymaker is trying to see, I observe a piece of data, and I assign probability lambda that it comes from model B, and probability 1 minus lambda that it comes from model S. So that's what this equation here shows you. Finally, once we have that object, we can actually construct an estimate of what is the posterior distribution of these model weights, or in what we're going to interpret as the policymaker view, whether the data is coming from secular stagnation or it's coming from an expectations-driven trap. Okay, so that's going to be our interpretation of lambda. So when lambda is equal to 1, in this case, in the Benavides, Schmidt, Grohe, and Uribe expectations trap type of world. Okay, so that's the name of the game. And we do that with our model, with our data. And this figure shows you the sequence or the time evolution of that model weight. On the x-axis, you have the time from, I think it starts 1998 towards 2012. And then you have, on the y-axis, you have the probability of being in the expectations trap model. you can see that at the beginning in the sample, you have a lot of uncertainty. So the bands, which are the shaded areas, are quite spread. But essentially, as time goes by and you keep getting information that interest rates are at zero, inflation keeps going down, and there's the correlation between inflation and output have a certain pattern, then the model prefers, or in our world, like the policymaker starts to learn that the data is more consistent with the expectations tribe hypothesis. Okay, so you know, I mean, this is quick. We extend the model to think about in the possibility that you can exit the trap. So far we consider a world in which you were always stuck at interest rate equals to zero, but it's possible that you might exit. It might be possible that that the natural rate is negative today, but might become positive tomorrow. It's also possible that if agents have expectations of deflation today, they might have expectations of inflation tomorrow. We consider that possibility to be sources of exiting the liquidity trap. On the left panel is our baseline model. Again, this is just another representation of the previous figure. You can see eventually that in this 3D plot, as time goes by, on this axis, then the probability of being in the expectations trap increases. When we allow for the possibility that these liquidity traps can be temporary, we eventually get the same result, but there is a lot more uncertainty because now there's always the possibility that you might remain in the liquidity trap, you might exit, and there might be these shocks that are driving you back and forth. But eventually, as time goes by, since the Japanese experience has been such a prolonged period of zero lower bound, you end up in that right corner. Okay, so policy implications, it's a challenge to disentangle this source of liquidity trap, especially in real time. One needs to modify, one needs to understand the source of the recession. We do two theoretical propositions in the paper in terms of indexation policies that allow you to eliminate the expectations trap and allow you to generate the stimulus and the secular stagnation. We do not do an analysis of trade-offs of these policies, but we think that's very interesting for future research. So let me stop there. I'll leave the conclusion slides on the screen so that you have time to ask questions if you want. Oh, let me just put it there. I have Q&As. So it says, it would be useful to spell out why you need to restore on the delta wedge as opposed to low growth prospects like the Benigno-Fornaro restart paper. It is intuitively surprising that in expectations driven trap, daily shock is recessionary. How about expectations? Okay, so let me answer the first question just quickly. So the difference with the Benigno-Fornaro paper is that they have endogenous growth in the model. So in our model, growth is exogenous. So we could generate the same type of growth traps as Benigno and Fornaro, and even in their framework, we can also generate secular stagnation episodes. So that mechanism is still present in our paper. And I'll get back to you on the AD shock that's recessionary. I'm not sure what you mean by AD shocks driven by expectations or policy shift in expectations. In our setting, the only thing that's being set in terms of expectations are inflation expectations. So somebody else had a question. So I really don't know. Like first, as Gustavo mentioned, like we don't use an interest rate target, but in a way you can think of as the fixed exchange rate that we have as a form of if you want to think about it, kind of like the monetary policy itself is based on an exchange rate peg, And it's possible that in open economies, having a fixed exchange rate might open up the possibility for this type of equilibrium as well. That's not something that this model is designed to answer because it's a model of the closed economy. But definitely, you know, in terms of fiscal situation, the implications of fiscal policies under exchange rate pegs and zero lower bound might be different than when the interest rate is not constrained by the zero bound or the exchange rate is allowed to float. Okay, unless there's more questions, which I would be happy to take if they allow us to stay here a little bit more and to let the other presenters to also ask other questions about their paper. So thank you, everyone. If you guys want to hang out a little bit, a couple of minutes here, I think maybe we can stay, but we check with the colleagues. So thank you all. So I'll just open the mic to Carlos and to Marco to say goodbye.
Goodbye, Pablo. Goodbye, Carlos.
Thank you very much.
Thank you for presenting your papers. Thank you. Bye.
Bye.